Provident Healthcare Partners is a healthcare investment bank that is focused on transaction advisory services. We created this podcast for healthcare executives, entrepreneurs, shareholders, and providers who are interested in learning more about the world of healthcare consolidation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode in Provident Healthcare Partners podcast series. The topic of our conversation here today is talking about the final phases of a transaction, how best to prepare for that ultimate transaction event that is becoming more commonplace for healthcare businesses across the continuum. We're focusing a lot of our discussion today around especially structuring elements, regulatory elements, and preparation for the legal due diligence side of a transaction. And we're lucky enough to be joined by a guest on our podcast today, Hal Katz from Husch Blackwell. So Hal, appreciate you taking some time and joining us here today. Maybe for our listeners' benefit, would you mind providing just a quick overview on yourself, some of the areas that you focus on, but also a little bit of background on the Husch Blackwell team and some of your capabilities?
It'd be my pleasure. Always great to be with Provident. Thank you for inviting me and including me. My practice focuses on healthcare and life sciences, representing physicians, facilities, other providers of all types, and other businesses in mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, and healthcare regulatory matters all across the country. Husch has 800 plus lawyers in our 25 offices across the country. Around 120 of us focus on the healthcare and life sciences industry specifically, and we are housed in what we call our healthcare and life sciences strategic business unit. Within our business unit, in addition to our M&A and healthcare regulatory specialties, we have specialists who focus on healthcare compliance, cybersecurity, intellectual property, labor and employment, tax, commercial litigation, real estate, and even cannabis. So that's a little bit about my general practice area in the firm. I'm happy to share a little bit about my recent transactions. If that's helpful, you let me know what else I could add.
Yeah, I think just a couple of recent transactions that you've worked on, especially for a lot of our listeners who are kind of concentrated in the healthcare services field, maybe groups that they might be familiar with would be great. And, how you think about your firm as being a little bit different than perhaps some of your peers, I'm sure would be appreciated by our listeners as well.
Sure. Well, recently I've been involved in everything from representing a private equity fund and the purchase of a large physical therapy platform. I've also recently represented a ophthalmology practice in the sale to a private equity-backed ophthalmology platform, representing an orthopedic practice in the acquisition of another orthopedic practice. Recently, I was on the team that helped Talkspace go public through a SPAC, and currently representing a nationwide direct primary care provider in the development of its business model. As far as the firm and how we differentiate ourselves from other law firms, I would say that our healthcare experience is deep and wide, with the structure of our practice being all within a business unit. All of our lawyers, from corporate lawyers to our real estate lawyers, our labor and employment lawyers to our IP lawyers, all of our lawyers focus on the healthcare and life sciences industries. So they understand the business issues and the regulatory issues that are involved in the other specific issues that we might be called upon to provide our representation. So that context, that additional knowledge, I think, differentiates ourselves. It makes us more efficient. We don't have to pull in those specialists to help and provide them the additional healthcare industry and regulatory background when they need to support a transaction, because our team already has that knowledge. The other thing that differentiates us from our competitors, I would say, is our innovation and our flexibility, both in how we use technology to connect and engage our clients, but also in our pricing arrangements. We have a pricing team that helps us come up with the best pricing model for our clients, be it the traditional hourly rate or a hybrid blended rate model or fixed fee arrangements. We try and meet our clients' needs with more creativity and flexibility.
Great. That's really helpful, Hal, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate your healthcare-specific expertise, your transactional expertise, but also kind of the flexible and knowledgeable approach that you bring to the table. So appreciate that background. And just in terms of the other speakers on our podcast today, this is AJ Shekar. I'm a director with Provident Healthcare Partners, and I have my colleague Eric Major on, who's a managing director with Provident as well. In terms of kind of the first topic we'd like to discuss on our podcast today, most often what we see from the groups that we work with are that they haven't necessarily gone through a sell-side transaction in the past. They may have general corporate counsel that handle matters like contracts and regulatory issues, but oftentimes we're recommending to our clients that they select qualified sell-side legal counsel that has experience working through these transactions in the past. And so, Hal, maybe from your perspective, it would be great to hear some of the considerations you'd encourage healthcare entrepreneurs, shareholders to keep in mind as they go through kind of the vetting process for finding the right sell-side counsel for their transaction.
Definitely, AJ. Well, I would say first that while it's tempting and convenient to rely upon long-standing or even current legal counsel to assist in the transaction, I would highly recommend that whoever is engaged have actual M&A experience. I think that's really valuable. It doesn't necessarily have to be in healthcare specifically, but it sure does help. Either way, someone on the team is going to need to have strong healthcare regulatory expertise, as well as tax, labor and employment, and real estate expertise. It will also be really important to confirm they have the capacity to get the deal closed within the targeted date and timeline. As you well know, these transactions require a fairly immediate level of responsiveness, and that includes working into the evening and on the weekends. And it's not uncommon for the traditional legal counsel who doesn't do a lot of M&A deals to have their responsiveness a little bit more spread out. They've got many other things that they're juggling. They're not usually working with this kind of cadence. So I think those are really important things to consider and to ask when selecting counsel.
All really great points, Hal. I think, a lot of the points you touched on are similar to our perspectives in that, it's important to have experience, but also efficiency on your side with respect to going through a transaction. And oftentimes our clients who haven't necessarily been through that process before, having advisors who can, handhold them through the process, but also provide kind of value adds from market reads and experience having done this many times over is very important to consider when selecting sell-side legal counsel. Eric, maybe from your perspective, when's the best time for a healthcare organization to engage with counsel? There's obviously various stages of a transaction process, but would love to hear your perspective as far as when the best time would be to tee someone up for a legal counsel role in this transaction.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I think generally speaking, we would advise our clients to, engage with transaction counsel early in the process, even before we go to market. I think as we'll talk about in this podcast, there are a number of things that make sense to address pre-marketing in terms of just internal housekeeping on the legal side, as well as handling things like retiring doctors, and if it's a physician group or partnership track physicians, for example. So, I do think it makes sense to typically, engage with counsel shortly after hiring an investment banker around the same time. Doesn't necessarily mean that transaction counsel will be intimately involved until really we get to legal documentation, but it is good to have them involved early for any housekeeping that needs to be done prior to going to market.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's obviously various stages of the transaction process, Eric, as you outlined. I think it would be great for our listeners to understand what legal diligence work streams occur at each phase of the process, maybe starting with even as early as kind of the pre-marketing preparation process, but then talking through what to expect in marketing and likely what the heaviest lift is, which is in the legal due diligence process. So, Eric, maybe we can just start off on especially that internal preparation and kind of house cleaning process that's important to consider for, especially first-time shareholders going through a transaction.
Yeah, so I think one of the first things that our clients will do prior to going to market is really just evaluate any internal preparation and housekeeping that needs to be done. I think generally speaking, time on the front end, typically saves time and money on the back end. The first thing that we would recommend is assembling an internal team that can help coordinate data requests and gathering of information. Typically, this would be a pretty tightly held team initially, early on in the process, and potentially expanded as we get further and further along. Some of the things that we'll recommend doing up front would be preparing a data room of information that we can gather so we can hit the ground running once we do get to the due diligence process. That would be gathering and aggregating, corporate documents for all of the related party legal entities, aggregating third-party contracts with vendors and leases, addressing any potentially expired contracts that haven't been renewed, potentially addressing if there's lingering ownership from a retired provider, for example, cleaning that up prior to going to market. I think these are a few examples of areas where we think it makes sense to spend time upfront and potentially make a much more seamless process on the back end.
And I think to one of your points, one of the areas that we see some pre-planning kind of needs from a transaction structuring standpoint are just kind of what the implications are of different ownership structures on kind of taxation and ultimate proceeds allocation as well. I feel like this comes into play, especially with some of our larger shareholder-based physician group transactions. So Hal, maybe from your perspective, help our listeners understand some of the different implications of the various ownership structures out there. For instance, the C Corp versus S Corp issues that might exist, and how best to take this pre-market preparation time to potentially address problematic issues down the road.
Great question, AJ. These issues can have a significant financial impact on the sellers, and being informed and educated on these issues in advance allows them to do some preparation and maybe even some changing of the corporate structure before going to market. As you've alluded, it's not uncommon for the sellers to have a number of different types of legal entities as a part of its business structure. Each of these legal entities can be taxed differently. They can be a C Corp, they can be a LLC, they can be a partnership, and how they've been taxed for federal income tax purposes will be major considerations in how the deal is structured. The first thing we would be doing is working with the seller's tax advisors to understand the existing structure and why it's been formed, created the way it has been. We want to make sure that there's good communication, there aren't any assumptions on why the model has been structured this way. And if there are changes that we can make to avoid a negative tax impact on the sellers before closing, we will definitely do that by transferring ownership or transferring assets to a different legal entity before the structuring. We might even find that the legal entity was not properly formed. It might be a non-professional entity that should have been designated as a professional entity. So those cleanup items get resolved prior to closing. But to your main point, we want to avoid a double taxation or a negative adverse financial impact, because the corporate structure is not the preferred model, both for the seller before we do the deal and taking into consideration how the buyer may want the entity to be structured post-closing will result in a favorable outcome for everybody involved.
Appreciate that context. I think, what we believe, and I'm sure, Hal, you see the same thing, is, taking the time in the pre-marketing phase where you can really be prepared and address some, potential issues proactively, ultimately sets you up well for creating an efficient marketing process and a due diligence process down the road. So this is kind of the time period where you can control, some of the narrative, you can control some of the issues that may come up later. So it's important to have that team advising, the company, the shareholders on how best to make this process as seamless as possible. And really kind of getting into the next phase of the process in terms of marketing, there's obviously a lot of structuring discussions, legal discussions that come into play, especially as groups are getting LOIs inbound from potential partners. Eric, just kind of along the same lines of preparing for different types of legal structures that could be impactful to the overall transaction for a healthcare company, we often see that for multiple shareholders in a business, it's important to have all groups aligned from a communication standpoint and expectation standpoint. So what factors do you kind of keep in mind when advising, especially multi-shareholder groups, and addressing some of their potential concerns through a process during this pre-marketing phase?
I think there are a few different areas where pre-marketing it makes sense to address some shareholder-specific concerns. One of which might be a situation where there could be a retiring provider, for example, in the group who potentially is lingering ownership within one of the entities, and it makes sense to clean that up prior to going to market. Another area that comes up pretty frequently are partnership track, employees within the company that intend to get ownership. Pre-marketing, there's a lot more flexibility on getting those partnership track providers into the ownership structure versus later on in the process where you have a valuation established for the company and offers on the table. There's a lot more restrictions around what valuation they can buy into and potentially tax concerns as well. So certainly recommend addressing partnership track doctors as early in the process as possible for our physician deals in particular. And then we touched on just some of the legal structures around C Corps and S Corps. I think, again, there's more flexibility on what can be done. This is addressed earlier on in the process versus later on when there's already been offers on the table and potentially more tax risk that comes up at that point.
AJ, let me add one more thing on the importance of that preparation before going to market. The buyer is not looking to take advantage of the seller, is not trying to for lack of a better expression, screw the seller. The buyer wants to do a great deal and wants to get the deal done as quickly as possible. What happens in the actual negotiation of the transaction is that issues come up that have to be solved. The more issues that come up that give the buyer concern, the more negotiation required and complexity that's involved in the transaction. And to the extent that we can avoid those issues before getting into negotiations, the cleaner the transaction will be, the quicker the transaction will be, the more efficient the transaction will be, which means the less spent on legal fees and the less risk to the transaction actually closing. So while we often see our sellers really eager to go to market and start the negotiating process, that little extra time on the front end can be really important and beneficial on the back end. Just really want to emphasize that point.
Yeah, that's a great point, Hal, and that was well said. I think ultimately this pre-market phase is where the advisors and the company have the opportunity to really set themselves up for success through marketing and due diligence down the road, and really where you have time to, dot all your I's and cross all your T's, for lack of a better phrase. And so having some of these initiatives in mind are really crucial to creating successful outcomes down the road and as painless of an experience as possible for the shareholders of the company, as well as kind of the buyer entity as well, and setting up the partnership on a good footing post-close. So I appreciate your perspectives on the pre-marketing side of things. As we fast forward to transactions that you've worked on after you've gone through some of this pre-marketing prep work, what should shareholders expect when they start getting offers in their business, from potential partners. They're in the process of, figuring out who the best partner is, but negotiating the best deal as well. Eric, maybe from your perspective, what are some of the key kind of non-economic terms outside of kind of your typical purchase price and rollover equity considerations that are important for shareholders to consider and be well prepared for in a transaction process?
Yeah, I would say at the LOI phase, Provident will work in tandem with legal counsel in order to best negotiate the letter of intent. Obviously, in addition to purchase price, the valuation of the business, rollover equity, and those components, we'll also take the lead on some other key non-economic points. I think these range from non-compete terms, which obviously legal counsel will be involved in that. But having worked on many of these deals in the past, there's a lot of market information that we have in order to negotiate those terms. Getting board seats, for example, on the parent company's board, that can be part of the negotiating point and a key differentiator, when you're comparing offers from multiple groups. Just better understanding the governance structure. If it's a physician deal, for example, getting seats on a clinical governance board in addition to the TopCo board, addressing rep and warranty insurance and the terms that we typically see on that in terms of the buyer covering the policy and how the retention is split. So I think our negotiating points will largely remain business related, but they do intersect with some of the legal points that counsel will also help with.
That's all helpful context. Hal, maybe from your perspective, what are some ways executives and shareholders can prepare for this LOI negotiation process and be well situated for when legal documents are traded in the ultimate due diligence process down the road?
AJ, I think this is where it's really helpful and valuable to have legal counsel that is experienced in M&A transactions, and specifically within the healthcare industry, and maybe even in this kind of specialty. They can help the sellers, the owners, understand the kind of issues that are important in these transactions, the kind of terms that typically are included, and help them set expectations around what's reasonable, what's market, what might be a stretch, because you definitely don't want sellers going in with unreasonable expectations. Those unreasonable expectations not only potentially make them unhappy, frustrated when the buyer rejects them or counters significantly off from what was proposed by the sellers, but it also potentially creates some ill will or credibility concerns on the part of the buyer when they see those terms come back their way. So doing either their own research or relying upon their advisors like Provident and legal counsel to understand what's involved in these negotiations and what's market are good steps to take before negotiating the terms of the LOI.
All very helpful. And I'm sure for a lot of shareholders that haven't necessarily been through this process before, it can be a little bit overwhelming in terms of the key legal documents that are part of a sale process. You have purchase agreement, employment agreements, non-competes, a bunch of different structural documents like management services agreements, et cetera. But Hal, maybe just for our listeners' benefit, could you walk us through what kind of key legal documents there are and the purposes of each, alongside any key terms that individuals should be keen to understand with their advisors' help?
Sure, AJ. First, we're going to have the purchase agreement. Depending upon the structure of the transaction, it's either going to be an asset purchase agreement or it's going to be a securities exchange or membership interest purchase agreement, some kind of equity purchase agreement. That is going to be where all of the terms for the purchase itself are going to be housed. Of course, that will include the purchase price, whether it will all be cash or it will be part cash and part rollover. It will include, if there's an escrow, what amount will be placed in escrow. If there's a holdback or earnout, that term would be included in the purchase agreement. It will house all of the representations and warranties indemnification. Those are the main provisions in the purchase agreement. That, of course, is the main umbrella document where all other ancillary documents are going to be referenced. It's frankly a beast of a document, as both you, AJ, and Eric well know, but that is the main document, and we can go into some more of those provisions here in a moment. The next document is often a standalone non-compete that accompanies the purchase agreement, where the seller, as a part of the transaction and receiving their portion of the purchase price, is going to agree to a non-compete. There will also be a separate employment agreement if they continue to be employed post-closing, the various terms and provisions that we can also go over here in a moment, and some other ancillary documents like you referenced, potentially a management services agreement depending on the structure. But back to the purchase agreement, we're going to want to make sure that purchase agreement aligns with the terms of the letter of intent, and anything else that's been promised needs to be housed in the purchase agreement or one of the other ancillary documents. If it's not in one of these documents, the sellers should not count on whatever has been promised to actually be delivered. I would say some of those other key terms like escrow, there are market ranges for these terms, be it the escrow or holdback, an earnout, the duration of an indemnification obligation. Escrow, we're seeing around 10% of the purchase price, but that's negotiated up and down based on what's uncovered in due diligence. On the reps and warranties, that look-back period is something that's open to negotiation and can range from 2 years for certain kinds of reps and warranties to all the way back to the formation of the business. On the indemnification obligation, that obligation can be negotiated for just 12 months after closing, or it can be indefinite, depending upon the type of claim that arises. All of that, again, subject to negotiation and usually subject to what is uncovered during the due diligence process. On the non-compete, that typically comes along with the purchase of a business. That's usually for a 5-year term. It starts upon the closing of the transaction and is usually a little bit more robust than what we would find also included in an employment agreement. That being the next transaction document, we'll just quickly run over. The employment agreement is going to be where title and roles and responsibilities are spelled out. Term and termination, can the agreement be terminated by the buyer without cause, or is there some fixed amount of time that has to elapse before the buyer can terminate without cause, for example, and not until the expiration of the first year, the second year, can the buyer terminate without cause? Or if there is a termination without cause provision, is severance provided? Is there a severance provision negotiated in the employment agreement? Compensation, of course, needs to be outlined, benefits. And then, as I alluded to a moment ago, a separate non-compete. This is, again, in addition to that standalone 5-year non-compete. There's usually a 1 to 2 year non-compete that will be in place during employment, and that will continue for 1 to 2 years following termination. And then we discussed there are potentially other ancillary documents like a management services agreement. That structure is one where a professional entity is going to continue in existence and be managed by the buyer in order to comply with state regulatory requirements. Then we would also look over that agreement and make sure that that was consistent with market.
All very helpful, Hal. I think that was well summarized. And there's obviously a lot of nuance that goes into a lot of these legal documents. And it's important to have experienced counsel that's done this a number of times to guide shareholders, executives towards what's market and kind of what aligns with the spirit of the transaction overall. I think, just given the complexities of healthcare transactions today, there's obviously a number of issues from a legal standpoint that could cause a deal to go sideways. Some of these can be certainly mitigated with the help of good transaction counsel and transaction advisors, but would love to hear from Eric and then maybe Hal as a next step as far as what typical issues you've seen come up, either from kind of the qualitative side or certainly from a nuts and bolts legal perspective that have implications for a transaction closing, and some perspectives on how these could be mitigated would be helpful. So Eric, maybe you can start first with your thoughts, and then we can get Hal's perspective as a next step.
Sure. Thanks, AJ. I think there are a few areas where on the legal front, it can cause a deal to go sideways. I think the first being, I would say, lack of transparency, on a transaction with non-owners in the business. So these could be leadership position within the company. These could be key partnership track providers, for example. I think the lack of communication with those individuals who are a critical component of the business. If they were to, for example, leave during a transaction, that could have implications on the deal, whether they're financial, restructuring of the transaction, or potentially even just lack of interest from the buyer if there's key executives or key employees that leave. So I think just being upfront and transparent with the key executives of the company on the intentions of the transaction and how their role would potentially look going forward, I think is critical to making sure that everyone's rowing in the same direction on a transaction process, particularly for partnership track providers. As we touched on, I think addressing the potential of a transaction earlier on is beneficial versus trying to blindside them a couple of weeks prior to closing. Typically, the reaction is a lot more adverse when they're forced to make a decision and a bit in the dark and are under the gun to make a decision in a short period of time. Other areas that I think need to be addressed up front, or at least on the ownership side of things, is really understanding the differing motivations of the owners of the company, especially for more diverse ownership bases. If you have owners that are looking to, for example, retire, if you have owners that are looking to roll over equity, if you have owners anywhere in the middle that maybe are looking to roll over some equity but intend to retire shortly after closing, I think all of that needs to really be discussed up front. And, obviously the details will be ironed out as you get further along in the process. But I think really being honest at the ownership level and about what your intentions are from the deal and your timeline, particularly to retirement, I think is important to be transparent about that, because ultimately if there are motivations of partners that aren't disclosed until very late in the process and it differs to what the buyer's understanding was earlier on, then again, that could potentially result in restructuring of the deal in ways that could, effectively take the deal in the wrong direction. And then lastly, I think the other component of a deal that becomes very difficult is just fatigue from both the executives of the company and the owners as well. These deals are very long processes, and obviously hiring good quality advisors helps to mitigate some of the onus on the team and the shareholders of getting the deal to the finish line. But even with advisors on your side, this is still a very exhausting process. So, one of the things that I think really starts to wear on groups later on in the deal is just what we call deal fatigue, and especially if there's changes to things later on in the process, trying to get comfortable with all of that, just considering there's been 6-8 months of work that's gone into this. That can be one of the more frustrating parts of the process, is just how exhausting these deals can be. So I think reiterating some of the points from earlier, having good quality, very experienced advisors on your side can help to mitigate some of that deal fatigue.
Those are all really good points, Eric. Hal, maybe from your perspective, what are some issues that you've seen that could cause a deal to go sideways, and thoughts on the best way of getting your hands around that earlier on?
Thanks, AJ. Well, Eric speaks from a great deal of experience. I don't know if you could hear it in his voice, but I did, feeling the pain that comes from some of the challenges that he described when sellers may not have done the best job around communication or setting expectations. So I completely agree with those points. Some of the other challenges, and somewhat related, arise when we have multiple entities with varying ownership and that have owners that aren't necessarily involved in all aspects of the business. So their interests aren't necessarily exactly aligned. and their level of ownership is going to vary. So they aren't as motivated, or they aren't motivated in the same way. So that can create a complicated approval process. It's just going to take more time, and there's more chance for someone to feel in one of the other entities that someone is being treated more favorably than they are. So this is going to require potentially more front-end work before starting the negotiating or even going to market process. You don't want those issues to arise in the middle of a transaction or close to closing, because then those other parties end up having a lot of leverage because they can prevent the deal from closing or create other complications or put the whole deal at risk for closing, for that matter. Consents and change of control provisions have the potential of delaying or derailing a transaction. Lenders and landlords and vendors often have requirements that may consent to a change in ownership or an assignment of assets. And depending on who those parties are, they may be more difficult or may not be happy about the transaction. So that can derail or cause a deal to go sideways. There can be regulatory issues that arise during due diligence or during the transaction that cause the buyer to have some concerns, and if not derail, they may delay or result in more money being placed in escrow or a greater indemnification obligation, or putting the rep and warranty coverage at risk for those kinds of claims. Those issues can relate to an expired license, for example, a lab license or facility license, could relate to HIPAA compliance or fraud and abuse compliance, or billing issues, billing practices, past billing practices. Those can very often create some concerns for a buyer.
All really great points. And I think at the end of the day, what's hopefully evident to our listeners is that there's a lot of complexity in these transactions. And what's important to have is good qualified advisors that could essentially identify some of these potential issues early on in order to create as seamless of an execution process as possible. And I think that involves not only just kind of investment banking representation, but also good quality legal representation, as well as just the broader team involved from the company perspective, tax advisors, et cetera, to ensure that the shareholders are adequately represented and that the transaction can unfold with as few, hitches as possible. Maybe just as we wrap up this podcast, is there anything else in terms of legal trends or aspects shareholders should consider from especially this legal preparation process from your perspective, Hal? And then would love to hear from Eric as well as we wrap things up here.
Thanks, AJ. I don't see any trends from a legal perspective necessarily. I do think the level of buying and selling is going to continue at least through the next year, even if there are changes in the tax law. I think there's tremendous opportunities for growth and innovation and improvement in the healthcare sector. I do see buyers and sellers shortening the timeline for closing, sellers becoming more informed, better prepared from advisors like Provident that allow a faster close time to occur. So if anything, I see an accelerated deal cycle going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with those points, Hal. We've seen a lot of activity really picking up this year, and it shows no sign of slowing down in the near term. And that said, we've certainly seen a noticeable uptick in education among shareholders around these transactions, the implications of them, which we haven't necessarily seen in years past. And I think overall, your point around these deals shortening in terms of the diligence windows and just execution time makes a lot of sense, just as the market becomes more familiar with transactions and there's a lot of good preparation taking place, hitting upon a lot of the themes that we talked about throughout this podcast to create an efficient process from start to finish. So I really appreciate you both taking some time here today to share your insights. And our listeners can feel free to reach out to any members of the Provident team on the podcast or Hal as well. We'll link his firm's contact information. And we appreciate everyone's time listening to our podcast here today.